not born into joy. No midwife smiled when you came out. No one cried tears of happiness. No one whispered, "She's beautiful," while cradling your soft red face. When they saw you were a girl, they didn't cheer, they calculated. Another mouth to feed, another back to bend, another body to marry off someday for grain or a cow or a fragile peace between families. They didn't name you quickly. Girls didn't get names on the first day. You weren't the heir. You weren't the legacy. You were the helper, the little one, the next in line to carry water and wipe tables and kneel in silence. Your mother held you with arms still weak from labor, blood not yet dried between her legs, breasts already sore. She looked down at your face, not with softness, but with exhaustion. She knew what was coming, not because she didn't love you, but because she did. And because she remembered exactly how it felt to grow up in a house that saw you as duty long before it saw you as a person. By the time you could walk, your hands were already being used. You were shown how to grip a ladle before you could pronounce your own name, how to twist flax into thread before you had a single book to read. If your mother was kind, she softened the wool with her own fingers first. If she wasn't, if she was tired, hurt, or broken, she snapped at you when your stitches went crooked. No one asked you what you wanted. No one asked if you felt tired, or cold, or scared of the dark when you were sent out to the well alone. They told you to carry things that were too heavy, told you to stay silent when the men were talking, told you to smile when you didn't feel anything. Your childhood wasn't a meadow of flowers and curiosity. It was a dim room that always smelled like onions and old firewood. It was a wooden stool too tall for your legs, a task that took hours, and hands too small to finish it. It was being scolded for bleeding on cloth, for falling asleep too early, for laughing too loud. You were not a daughter, you were labor. And no one ever told you there was supposed to be anything else. The first time it happened, you thought you were dying. It came in the night, thick and warm, soaking through the straw mat beneath you. You woke up sticky, damp, confused. The smell was sharp, metallic, animal. You thought something inside you had broken. You didn't scream, you didn't dare. You just sat there, legs pulled up, hands trembling under your shift, pressing between your thighs to feel what had happened. The blood was real, it kept coming. You didn't know how to stop it. Your mother knew, of course. She saw the stained cloths, the way you walked differently that morning. She didn't say much. Just handed you a strip of rough linen, already stained from someone else's time before you. No explanation, no comfort, no warning. She called it the curse. And in the village, that's what everyone called it. The women whispered about it like it was a sickness. The men ignored it entirely until they saw a blood stain. Then they frowned, turned away, acted disgusted, as if you had failed some test of purity. There were no clean pads. No private places to change. You used rags, thick, scratchy, and reused until they fell apart. You washed them in the stream when no one was watching. If you were lucky, you had more than one. If you weren't, you sat still and prayed it wouldn't show through your dress. No one explained what it meant, only that now you were a woman. That word didn't mean freedom, it meant risk. You were told to be careful, to be modest. To stay quiet, you were told that boys would look at you differently now, that if you were touched even once, it might be your fault. You bled through your rags more than once, at night, in church, while grinding grain. And every time it brought shame, not just the stain on your clothes, but the way women looked at you. Like you'd made a mess of something holy, like you'd been careless with your body. You learned to sit still, to wrap yourself tight, to hide the pain, the cramps, the clots. You learned that what happened inside your body made you dirty, unspoken, unwanted, even though no part of it was your choice. And so you bled every month, alone, in silence, carrying the weight of a shame you never asked for. No one ever asked if you were tired. You worked whether your stomach twisted with cramps or your back screamed from bending too long. You carried water jars with rags stuffed between your legs to catch the blood, and if they liked, you tied your apron tighter and kept walking. You woke before the sun. Always, you fed the animals, gathered kindling. Washed the same clothes again and again in freezing water that numbed your hands and cracked your knuckles open. Then you ground grain, then you baked, then you picked, sorted, mended, scraped, swept. You served meals you never sat down to eat. And when your belly swelled, when your body changed again and your blood stopped coming, the work didn't stop. It got harder. You carried that child while you chopped wood, while you bent over fires, while you washed your husband's feet. There were no midwives coming every week to check on you, no soft bed to rest in, no herbs unless someone pitied you enough to offer them. You gave birth in the same place you worked, on the dirt, on straw. On cloths you were told to burn afterward, and when the baby came, if the baby came, and if it lived, there was no rest then either. You nursed with cracked skin and a torn body, then you got back up, cleaned the floor. Held the baby with one arm and stirred porridge with the other. You couldn't say you were in pain. Pain was assumed. Pain was normal. Pain was ignored. If you got sick, you worked anyway. If you coughed up blood, you worked quietly. If your breasts were swollen, leaking, aching, you worked with milk stains down your front, because no one ever asked if you were well. They only asked if the bread was done, if the cloth was dry, if the child was quiet. You learned to hide how much it hurt. You learned that women who complained were weak, that women who cried were wasteful, that women who stopped were selfish. So you didn't stop, not when you bled, not when you broke. Not even when you wanted to, you just kept going, because in your world, a woman who stopped, disappeared. They told you marriage was a blessing, a step toward womanhood, a moment of honor, but no one asked if you wanted it. You weren't in the room when the decision was made. It happened between your father and another man, over a jug of sour wine, a whispered conversation behind the stable, or during a trade deal disguised as a family visit. They didn't speak about love, they spoke about goats, about boundaries between fields, about dowries and reputations. You were not a daughter, you were a bargain. You found out only after the hands were shaken. Your mother told you that he was a good man, which meant he wasn't a drunk or a criminal. That was enough. You were told to be grateful. He came to the door one evening. You were told to curtsy. He didn't look you in the eyes, just at your waist, your wrists, the slope of your shoulders, like weighing a sheep. You wore a borrowed dress on your wedding day. It was too tight at the ribs, too loose at the hips. You smiled because everyone told you to. The priest said the words in Latin. You repeated what you could. You didn't understand what you were agreeing to, only that it was forever. That night, they sent you to his house. You stepped over the threshold as someone's wife, but you didn't feel different. You felt smaller. He touched you like he had a right to, because now he did. You bled again. You didn't cry out. You were told not to. A good wife is quiet. A good wife is still. A good wife doesn't shame her husband by resisting. In the days after, you worked harder. You cleaned his floor, cooked his food, rubbed his feet. You learned his rhythms, when he wanted silence, when he wanted meat, when he wanted your body. You slept beside him but never felt next to him. Sometimes he was kind, sometimes he was, but either way you were his. There was no escape, no returning home, no second chance. If you were struck, you hid the bruise. If you were ignored, you blamed yourself. If you were sick, you got up anyway, because a married woman who failed her husband failed God. That's what the priest said. That's what your mother said. That's what everyone said. So you didn't fail, you served. You obeyed, you endured, and love. You didn't know if it came later, or if it was something only other women, freer women, ever got to choose. They told you childbirth was a blessing, that it was a woman's purpose. That it was a holy act, painful, yes, but noble. They didn't mention the blood, they didn't mention the screams, they didn't mention the silence that sometimes followed. You gave birth at home. Not because it was comforting, but because there was nowhere else to go. No hospital, no doctor, just a room with straw on the floor, a bucket of water gone cold too fast, a cloth that had been used before, and two women who had seen enough to know when things were going wrong. When the pain started, you tried to be strong. You'd heard stories, you knew it would hurt, but nothing prepared you for the way your bones felt like they were being torn open from the inside. Nothing prepared you for how long it would last, how loud your own voice would sound, how small the room would feel once it was filled with the smell of sweat and fear and blood. You pushed until your vision blurred. You screamed until your throat cracked. You begged until the women told you to stop, not because help was coming, but because it was. There was no medicine, no pain relief, no hands to hold that didn't also have other jobs to do. You bled and bled and bled. At one point, you thought you'd already died. You couldn't tell if the cries you heard were yours or someone else's. You drifted in and out of yourself, trying to stay conscious only because the midwife kept slapping your cheek to keep you from slipping too far. You felt your body tear, you felt your legs go numb, you felt your own breath start to fade, and then it was over. A sound, a cry, a baby. They lifted it up and it was red and wet and small, but you couldn't focus on it. You were too cold, too light, your body felt hollow, you couldn't speak. They pressed the child to your chest and told you to smile, but your hands were shaking, your teeth were chattering. You didn't know yet if you were going to survive. Because in your world, childbirth wasn't a celebration, it was a test of strength, of silence, of whether your name would be whispered in church next Sunday, or carved into wood by a man who never truly knew you. You didn't get flowers. You didn't get rest, you didn't get to say no. You only got this, a straw floor, a crying child, and a body that may never fully come back to you. They told you God loved you, but his voice never sounded like yours. You never heard a woman preach, never saw a woman at the altar, never read the words for yourself because you couldn't read. And even if you could, the Bible was locked away in Latin, and Latin was locked away in men. You were told your job was to listen, to kneel, to bear, to obey. The priest spoke from stone pulpits about sin and virtue and fire. He said women must be modest, silent, submissive. That Eve had tempted Adam, and ever since, women must carry the burden. You didn't ask questions. You weren't allowed to. To question was to doubt was to stray. And to stray, especially as a woman, was dangerous. They taught you that your suffering had meaning, that your pain in childbirth was holy, that your silence in marriage was righteous, that your work, your wounds, your weariness, all of it was part of God's plan, and who were you to question him? You knelt at Mass and whispered prayers you didn't understand. You crossed yourself because that's what your mother did. You confessed sins you couldn't name just to be safe. You were told to cover your hair, to lower your eyes, to fear hell more than you feared the men around you. You never spoke of the times you were touched without permission, never told anyone how you bled for days after childbirth, never admitted how sometimes, just sometimes, you wanted to run into the woods and scream until your voice gave out, because a good woman doesn't need to be heard. A good woman endures. A good woman suffers in silence. A good woman prays even when no one listens, and when you felt yourself slip, when the weight became too much. You told yourself it was your fault. You hadn't been faithful enough. You hadn't been grateful enough. You hadn't obeyed deeply enough. That's what the church taught you. Not faith, not peace. Just fear dressed in robes, holding scripture, smiling like salvation. They never taught you what to do when it happened. There was no rule, no warning, no word for it. You just knew instinctively that if a man touched you in a way that felt wrong, it was something to be ashamed of. Not for him, for you. And if you dared speak about it, you would be the one whispered about. You would be the one watched, judged, marked. You didn't know what to call it. No one did, because they never named it, because naming it would have meant admitting it happened. And no one wanted that, so they called it something else. A misunderstanding, a temptation, a girl being foolish. If it happened in the barn, they asked why you were there alone. If it happened during harvest, they asked why your dress was so thin. If it happened in the churchyard, they didn't ask anything. They just looked away. You tried to forget it at first. You tried to keep working like nothing had happened, but every time you walked past him, the one who pulled at your wrist, the one who pressed too close, your body flinched before your thoughts caught up. And you knew, he knew, everyone knew, but no one would say a word, because in your village, a man's name was heavier than a woman's truth. You learned not to speak, because speaking would cost you more than silence. It would cost you your standing. Your safety, your future. No one would marry a girl who accused a man. No one would defend her, not even her family, because shame spread like rot and no one wanted it in their house. So you swallowed it, the memory, the handprint. The guilt that wasn't yours but clung to you anyway. Sometimes it left a bruise, sometimes it left a child, and still it was your fault. They told you men had needs. They told you women had responsibilities. They told you your body was dangerous, not because of what could happen to it, but because of what it could provoke. You learned to be quiet before you learned to speak. You learned to smile through disgust. You learned to carry shame for things you didn't choose. And when it happened to other girls, your sister, your neighbor, your friend, you said nothing. Not because you didn't care, but because you understood. Because in a world where survival depended on silence. The truth was the first thing you were taught to bury. You were never in the stories. No one painted your face into a fresco. No one sang songs about the way you worked or bled or endured. You didn't become a saint. You didn't become a queen. You just lived, and that somehow was the greatest act of all. You woke before the sun and carried burdens no one saw. You stitched clothes with fingers cracked and bleeding. You raised children who never thanked you. You held your husband when he drank too much, when he struck too hard, when he left you pregnant again with nothing but silence to wrap around your ribs. You never once stopped working, even after miscarriage, even after death, even after you buried your third child and still had to boil the laundry before dusk. You were not given softness, you were not given rest, you were not given safety. And yet you stayed, you endured, you remembered how to smile, even if it was only for a few seconds while your child napped in your lap. You sang to yourself when no one was listening. You laughed quietly with your sister while peeling roots in the cold. You taught your daughter how to tie a knot, how to carry wood, how to protect her silence. Not because you wanted her to live like you, but because you wanted her to live. You never got to dream of more, but sometimes, late at night, when your body ached and your husband snored and your thoughts wandered into the corners of the ceiling, you wondered, what if you'd been born a man? What if you'd been taught to read? What if God had given you something other than silence? No answers ever came. Only mourning, only more work, only another day survived, and that was enough. You may not be remembered, you may not be named. But you were there, you held your family together with thread and breath and bone. You endured a world that expected you to vanish quietly, and instead, you stayed.